Tonight we're kicking things off with a question that often gets lost in the roar of tanks, the mud of trenches, and the chaos of total war. What did soldiers in World War II actually eat? From American K rations to German Osatz spread, Soviet cabbage soup to Japanese rice balls. Tonight, we're peeling back the layers of history, one can of corned beef at a time. Before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see this little global community come together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft ambient hume, and let's dive into the forgotten flavors of the front lines.
Let's embark on this evening's shared exploration. Before the thunder of artillery, the roar of tanks across European landscapes, or the scream of aircraft overhead, every military force confronted a consistent, unglamorous hurdle, nourishing its troops without inadvertently poisoning them. When we reflect on World War II, our minds typically conjure images of fierce combat, acts of heroism, and historical black and white newsreels. Rarely do we pause to contemplate the harsh, practical realities. For instance, did that soldier charging ashore at Normandy consume breakfast? And if so, what on earth was it? A brief disclosure: pancakes were definitively not on the menu. Supplying provisions for millions of combatants spread across continents wasn't merely an exercise in mass catering, it was a logistical catastrophe often accompanied by widespread dysentery. Rations needed to be easily transportable, resistant to spoilage, economical, and ideally, not provoke tears upon consumption. Taste was a distant fifth in terms of importance, ranking somewhere after criteria like won't detonate if dropped and doesn't attract vermin. Various nations devised distinct methods for tackling this issue. The Americans endeavored to apply scientific principles to their sustenance, yielding compact containers of optimism dubbed K-rations. The Germans, in the initial stages of the conflict, equipped their soldiers with substantial portions of meat and rye bread, eventually substituting these with something akin to a punishment in a tin. The British maintained an unwavering reliance on tea, as if it were the very cornerstone of their empire, a plausible assumption, perhaps. The Soviets habitually boiled cabbage, treating it as a sacred ritual. And the Japanese, well, they were expected to move swiftly and engage fiercely, at times subsisting solely on rice balls and sheer determination. Food transcended mere sustenance, it was a crucial element of morale. A warm meal could significantly boost spirits, while a cold, greasy tin of corned beef could utterly shatter them. Some soldiers developed a peculiar affection for their rations, while others vowed never to ingest another cracker. Many yearned not for glory or triumph, but for butter, fresh bread, and anything not encased in drab brown paper. As generals deliberated strategy in their war rooms, private soldiers in their foxholes were engaging in bartering chocolate for cigarettes, fervently hoping their bunkmate wouldn't snore through the mess call. So this evening, our discourse won't revolve around military victories or reconfigured borders. Instead, we'll delve into the world of spam, crackers, powdered eggs, and the genuine struggle between soldiers and the perplexing, questionable contents of their ration tins. For if there's one universal truth about warfare, it is that everyone must eat, even when the food itself seems to put up a fight. The K-ration. A cardboard calorie miracle. Imagine you are a U.S. soldier in the thick of World War II. You've endured a 10-mile march, narrowly avoided being shot 6 times, and haven't encountered a functioning flush toilet in weeks. Your stomach is emitting noises that could easily be mistaken for artillery fire. What awaits you? The K-ration. A compact, calorie-dense marvel of cardboard engineering, seemingly designed by individuals who had never actually had to consume one themselves. Let's dissect its components. The K-ration comprised 3 distinct packages: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Each was roughly the dimensions of a small brick and, at times, possessed a similar heft. Every container held just enough sustenance to technically qualify as nutritional, while simultaneously preparing you for combat through a profound culinary disillusionment. Breakfast initiated with a promising start, a can of ham and eggs, which managed to be neither adequately ham-like nor egg-like. The consistency? Picture a hybrid of Spam and drywall. Accompanying this were rock-hard crackers, instant coffee, powdered lemonade, one might question its inclusion, a couple of sticks of chewing gum, and 4 cigarettes. Because nothing screams balanced breakfast quite like a Marlboro. And, as a crowning touch, a solitary sheet of toilet paper. Just one. Use it wisely. Lunch offered no significant improvement. You might encounter a cheese spread boasting more chemical additives than actual cheese, another stack of jaw-breaking biscuits, and a chocolate bar so dense it could serve as tank armor. No spoon available? No issue. You'd resort to your knife, a twig, or sheer, unadulterated fury to extract its contents. Dinner presented meat and beans. A concoction that resembled a crime scene in a can. Alongside this came more crackers, more gum, and occasionally, if your prayers were sufficiently fervent, a minuscule fruit bar that tasted as if someone had merely whispered the word apple over a piece of wood. Despite their unpalatable nature, care rations were, from a nutritional standpoint, quite remarkable. They provided approximately 3,000 calories daily, packed with protein, fat, and sugar, with just enough flavor to ensure you wouldn't accidentally enjoy them. Troops frequently bartered components amongst themselves, much like traders in a prison system, cigarettes for chocolate, cheese for crackers, anything to circumvent the hem trauma. Yet, every so often, a genuine Hershey bar would surface. Real chocolate, true comfort. For a single bite, you were transported from the mud and back home. That alone rendered the remainder of the ration tolerable. So, yes, the care ration was dry, strangely square, and possessed a flavor reminiscent of warfare. But ultimately, it was the essential fuel that propelled the victory in a global conflict, one questionable meat product at a time. The D-ration. Survival in a chocolate bar disguise. If the K-ration represented the Army's interpretation of a meal, then the D-ration was their concept of a survival threat masquerading as a dessert. The D-ration bore the appearance of a chocolate bar, was packaged like a chocolate bar, and was issued to soldiers as a chocolate bar. However, the resemblances ended there. This was certainly not your sweet, comforting Hershey's Kiss. No, the D-ration was meticulously engineered in collaboration with the U.S. Army to achieve 3 primary objectives: 1. To resist melting, 2. To possess an indefinite shelf life, and 3. To taste like absolute despair. It was roughly the size of a deck of cards and possessed a density sufficient to halt a bullet. Indeed, some soldiers swore it had, whether in their packs or their intestines. The ingredients were technically foodstuffs: chocolate, sugar, oat flour, and a touch of cocoa fat. The outcome? A brown brick that could readily function as a bludgeon or emergency construction material. Why was it manufactured in such a manner? Because it was designed to endure the rigors of tropical heat, arid deserts, and frigid tundras without transforming into a viscous goo. And crucially, the military explicitly requested that it be unappetizing, ensuring soldiers would only consume it when truly facing starvation. Mission accomplished. The bar was so incredibly hard that attempting to bite into it without prior softening could lead to significant dental emergencies. Some soldiers attempted to grate it into hot water. Others simply stared at it in bewildered confusion. A few, according to legend, employed it to hammer tent stakes. But, credit where credit is due. It contained calories, approximately 600 per bar, enough to sustain a man through a day of combat, albeit barely. If you found yourself stranded behind enemy lines or trapped in a foxhole with only your rifle and a string of poor decisions, the D-ration might just preserve your life. Emotionally, however, not so much. To the Army's credit, they eventually recognized that providing troops with chocolate that doubled as masonry was detrimental to morale. Later versions of the D ration became marginally softer and vaguely more palatable. But the damage was already done. Soldiers recalled the original bar with the same degree of fondness one reserves for a root canal. So, the next time you hear someone declare, "Chocolate makes everything better," remember the D ration. The bar that unequivocally proved them wrong. The field kitchen. A glimmer of warmth amidst misery. If the K ration was survival sustenance and the D ration was edible punishment, then the field kitchen represented a soldier's sole opportunity to consume something warm, recognizable, and only moderately soul-crushing. Field kitchens, also colloquially known as rolling misery carts, were mobile culinary units towed by trucks or horses. They constituted the military's endeavor at fine dining on the move. And by fine, we mean not cold and not in a can. These kitchens continuously produced industrial quantities of stew, beans, gravy-like concoctions, and enough coffee to propel an infantry division through a minor existential crisis. Meals were dispensed cafeteria-style. Soldiers would queue up with their trusty mess kit, a metal tray that appeared more suited for a science experiment, and shuffle forward, silently imploring that the individual ahead didn't claim the final ladle of something vaguely resembling meat. The food was doled out with military precision, one scoop for you, accompanied by a suspicious glare, and then on to the next private. The menu varied depending on your location. In Europe, you might encounter creamed chipped beef on toast, affectionately and permanently rechristened by the troops as SOS, stuff on a shingle, though most employed a far less polite epithet. In the Pacific, you were fortunate if it wasn't merely rice and fragments of hot dog submerged in broth. Coffee, however, was sacrosanct. It was potent, bitter, and brewed in volumes capacious enough to reanimate the deceased. Soldiers consumed it hot, cold, black, or with powdered milk, as long as it kept them awake and sufficiently irate. The most appealing aspect of the field kitchen experience? The smell. It signified that food was imminent. The worst aspect? Virtually everything else. Your meal was served outdoors, often amidst rain, snow, or a type of mud that harbored its own thriving ecosystem. You sat on rocks, helmets, or the damp ground. Forks were non-existent. There was no ambience. Just you, your comrades, and a tin of beans that might predate your commanding officer. Nevertheless, when it was hot and remotely chewable, field kitchen fare felt like a taste of heaven. It lacked glamour. But in a world dominated by chaos, bullets, and K rations, it was the closest approximation to comfort food. German rations, from abundance to austerity. At the onset of World War II, German soldiers marched into battle with a distinct swagger, immaculate uniforms, and something astonishingly rare in wartime logistics, actual food that genuinely resembled proper meals. The early war Wehrmacht ration was frankly luxurious when compared to what most other armies were grimly choking down. The standard soldier's pack contained rye bread, various sausages, butter, cheese, canned meats, marmalade, and coffee. Well, that's coffee, which we shall address later with the contempted merits. Each soldier was expected to carry enough provisions for a couple of days, a commendable notion until one considered the sheer weight added by rifles, ammunition, grenades, and the incipient frostbite. Despite this, German rations were predicated on the concept of 3 hot meals per day, with field kitchens diligently trailing behind like slightly overstressed food trucks. Breakfast might consist of dark rye bread with jam or butter, supplemented by that roasted acorn faux coffee. Lunch offered tinned meat, cheese, and perhaps a boiled potato or 3. Dinner, if fortune favored you and you weren't actively under artillery bombardment, might be soup or stew concocted from whatever was still mobile that morning. Sausage, particularly Metwurst and Leberwurst, was a dietary staple. It was easily transportable, rich in protein, and vaguely reassuring. It was also, quite notably, incredibly pungent in a sealed tin, transforming every trench into an olfactory blend of iron, sweat, and spicy pork. And naturally, the Germans had bread. Good bread, real bread. Soldiers frequently reminisced more about losing access to proper bread than about losing a warm bed. One Wehrmacht veteran described ration bread as the only softness in an otherwise very sharp war. Field kitchens bolstered this system, ceaselessly producing steaming cauldrons of stews, boiled meats, and dumplings whenever feasible. Morale was high, stomachs were relatively full, and German efficiency appeared insurmountable. But, and there is always a but, this initial golden era of German rations was not destined to last. As the conflict expanded and supply lines grew perilously thin, the sausage turned rancid, the bread became stale, and the once proud field kitchens were left marooned in frozen forests with nothing but icy potatoes and patriotic memories. Nevertheless, for a fleeting, bratwurst-filled period, the average German soldier possessed something immensely valuable in wartime: warm food, respectable coffee substitutes, and the comforting illusion that this whole grim affair might be concluded by Christmas. As World War II relentlessly progressed and Hitler's vision of blitzkrieg glory devolved into a logistical quagmire, German rations took a precipitous turn for the worse. The German Satz. A culinary decline. By 1942, the situation had grown dire, leading to a period of culinary innovation in Germany. The term Satz, a German word roughly translating to imitation or, more accurately, this isn't food, but we're calling it that anyway, became a grim reality. Genuine coffee had vanished. In its place emerged Satzkaffee, a peculiar concoction of roasted acorns, chicory, sugar beet, or barley. It exuded an aroma of despair and tasted akin to something brewed in an old boot. It only technically resembled coffee if you had no prior experience with the beverage and possessed an exceptionally forgiving palate. Once a dark, hearty, and soul-sustaining staple, bread was now heavily adulterated. It was filled with fillers like sawdust, straw flour, potato starch, and whatever else could be legally ground into a powder. While you might still refer to it as bread, your teeth would undoubtedly disagree. Some soldiers wryly remarked that it served a dual purpose as helmet padding. Butter, too, disappeared, supplanted by Satz margarine, a pale, flavorless grease that managed to be simultaneously oily and chalky. Meat transformed into a distant memory. Cans of meat product began to appear, their labels conspicuously lacking any specification of the animal involved, and frankly, it was often wiser not to inquire. Even sausages, that hallowed pillar of German cuisine, were diluted. Horse meat entered the mixture, followed by turnip filler. Eventually, some sausages comprised up to 40% plant material. Imagine biting into a bratwurst and encountering a mouthful of damp newspaper. Welcome to the Reich's gastronomic downfall. The issue transcended mere taste. These Satz rations were critically deficient in nutrients, calories, and most importantly, morale. Troops on the Eastern Front, expending thousands of calories daily in sub-zero temperatures, were receiving food incapable of sustaining even a small dachshund. Starvation, illness, and sheer desperation inevitably followed. Soldiers became resourceful, boiling shoe leather, bartering with local populations, or even raiding enemy supply lines just to procure something genuine. A single American chocolate bar could command a higher value than a stack of Wehrmacht bread. What had initially been an efficient, fuel-powered war machine was now operating on little more than cabbage water and caffeine deceptions. The Germans had begun with authentic food. Now they were chewing misery and washing it down with roasted roots. The Eastern Front, where food went to die. If there was a geographical location where food met its ultimate demise during World War II, it was undoubtedly the Eastern Front. Spanning thousands of miles from Berlin to the frigid heart of Russia. The Eastern Front presented the logistical equivalent of attempting to run a pizza delivery service across a glacier while simultaneously enduring gunfire, shelling, and the occasional threat of wolf attacks. German soldiers who once relished sausage and rye bread found themselves huddled in snow drifts, their fingers frozen and their stomachs empty. Rations dwindled, supply lines fractured, and morale evaporated faster than soup, which is to say, not at all. Let's consider that, soup. A meal on the Eastern Front often amounted to hot water with a few potato peels, if one was exceptionally fortunate. If not, it was simply water. Often frozen solid by the time it reached its recipient. Bread? It arrived moldy or, more frequently, not at all. Meat? A mere rumor. Soldiers would burn precious firewood, not for warmth, but to thaw their canned meat products, which might have been beef, pork, or recycled optimism. And heaven help you if the label had worn off. You'd have to identify the mystery contents by scent alone. In winter, men boiled snow for drinking water, heated tins over engine blocks, and sometimes, out of sheer desperation, consumed snow directly. This seemingly harmless act paradoxically lowers core body temperature, bringing one perilously closer to freezing to death with a mouthful of slush. Then there were the rats, audacious, plump, and suspiciously well-fed. Some units resorted to capturing and cooking them. Others viewed the rats as direct competitors, engaging in midnight skirmishes over scraps, battles that historians mercifully omit from textbooks. Desperation also fueled bartering. Soldiers exchanged cigarettes for bread, buttons for sugar, or a pair of socks for half a boiled potato. A single spoonful of jam could ignite a brawl. If you possessed chocolate, you were considered a deity. Despite the gnawing hunger, the relentless cold, and the utter absence of anything resembling a balanced meal, soldiers persevered. They jested, cursed, and consumed whatever they could scrounge. But every mealtime became a solemn ritual. Unwrap the tin, offer a silent prayer, and hope it didn't fight back. On the Eastern Front, food was not merely scarce, it was a cruel game of survival played one frozen spoonful at a time. The Red Army, sustenance through sheer willpower. If German troops on the Eastern Front were consuming misery, Soviet soldiers were subsisting on sheer willpower. The Red Army's approach to nutrition was starkly simple: if it filled a stomach and didn't cause immediate death, it was deemed dinner. Official rations typically consisted of black bread, cabbage soup, buckwheat porridge, kasha, a few boiled potatoes, perhaps some dried fish, and the perpetually reliable unsweetened tea. In winter, that tea was often just melted snow with a twig floating in it. Meat was documented on paper as part of the rations, yes, but in reality, it was as rare as a warm bath in Stalingrad. When meat did arrive, it was frequently salted to an extreme degree, making its consumption more of a jaw exercise than a meal. Still, it was regarded as a luxury. Soldiers would meticulously lick the fat from old meat tins just to savor the memory. And then there was the bread, the undisputed cornerstone of every Soviet meal. It was coarse, dark, and fashioned from whatever grain was still permissible for consumption. It was also rigorously rationed. A typical serving could fit in the palm of your hand and would vanish in 2 bites if you didn't attempt to prolong it by slowly licking it like a melancholic wartime lollipop. Cabbage emerged as the unsung hero of Soviet wartime cuisine. Whether in soup, stew, stuffed, shredded, or fermented, if there was a pot, there was cabbage in it. So ubiquitous was cabbage, in fact, that some Soviet soldiers quipped they could smell it in their sleep and fantasized about transforming into turnips simply to escape the relentless cycle. Still hungry? Good. Now you grasp the Soviet wartime diet. Soldiers routinely entered combat underfed and overexerted. Rations were theoretically supposed to be delivered daily, but in war-torn zones, This became, when possible, which often translated to never. Consequently, they improvised. Foraging became a way of life. Soldiers unearthed frozen potatoes from abandoned farms, hunted wild animals when opportunities arose, and bartered cigarettes or spare boots for a boiled egg. Occasionally, they even traded with German prisoners of war, food for silence. The true miracle was their endurance. Malnourished, exhausted, yet utterly relentless, Soviet troops pressed forward on fumes and boiled cabbage, demonstrating that sometimes what truly sustains a soldier isn't calories, but an indomitable, cabbage-fueled stubbornness. Red Army improvisation. The culinary art of survival. When official rations invariably ran dry, Soviet soldiers did not simply starve in silence, they adapted with loud ingenuity. With a blend of creativity, desperation, and occasionally the culinary sensibilities of a raccoon, Red Army troops transformed battlefield improvisation into an extreme sport. Imagine yourself as a soldier on the outskirts of Leningrad. You haven't seen a supply truck in a week. Your cabbage soup has regressed to mere water with a single floating leaf, and your last piece of black bread has sprouted a beard. What do? Option 1, forage. Soldiers meticulously scoured the countryside for anything remotely edible. This included berries, tree bark, boiled grass, dandelions, and even flower bulbs. One particularly resourceful unit discovered how to roast shoe leather, not because it tasted good, it didn't, but because it was, technically, organic. Option 2, barter. A spare pair of socks might procure you a potato, a broken watch perhaps a spoonful of lard. Tobacco served as currency, soap was akin to gold. And if you possessed a tin of meat, you could persuade someone to pen a letter home for you and even clean your rifle. Option 3, theft, or, as they euphemistically termed it, unauthorized logistics. Soviet soldiers occasionally raided abandoned German outposts solely for food. One Red Army veteran vividly recalled the sheer euphoria of discovering a box of Wehrmacht sausages. The first time I cried and salivated at the same time. Field kitchens, when operational, were masters of enigmatic cooking. Cooks would toss in whatever ingredients they possessed, beets, onions, mystery meat, pickled vegetables dating back to 1913. The resulting soup was often red, hot, and suspiciously chewy, but it largely kept you going. And yet, despite these hardships, morale did not collapse. Why? Because Soviet culture glorified suffering as a testament to strength. Soldiers transformed deprivation into a badge of honor. They recounted jokes about their meager rations. They sang songs about dried fish. They even gave names to their tin cups. An act that was either a display of camaraderie or a symptom of a mild fever dream. In the Red Army, mealtime was not about flavor, it was about survival theater. Every bowl of borscht, every crumb of bread, was a defiant declaration, we're still here. The British Army, enduring on tea and stubbornness. If World War II were judged solely on culinary performance, the British Army might have been compelled to surrender to its own menu. British soldiers did not eat, they endured. Their rations constituted a war within the larger conflict. A daily ritual of unseasoned punishment washed down with an inexhaustible supply of optimism and as much tea as humanly possible. Let's begin with the sacred trinity: tea, hardtack biscuits, and bully beef. Tea was paramount. More than just a beverage, it was morale in liquid form. Soldiers brewed it in tin mugs, mess tins, helmets, or anything that could retain heat and didn't leak excessively. At times, there was no milk, no sugar, no dignity, just hot brown water and hope, but it undeniably carried them through. Hardtack biscuits were seemingly designed to outlast the soldiers themselves. Dense, chalky, and almost utterly tasteless, they possessed the structural integrity of roofing tiles. They served multiple purposes as plates, coasters, or even makeshift armor in a desperate situation. Many troops contended that their dental ailments stemmed not from combat, but from their arduous attempts to bite these biscuits. Then came bully beef, also known as tinned corned beef. It possessed the visual appeal of canned cat food and the consistency of congealed regret. It was excessively salty, oily, and could be consumed hot, cold, or with the appropriate degree of emotional detachment. You might slice it, fry it, dice it, or simply stare at it until your appetite made a hasty retreat from the tent. Also included in the standard ration were powdered eggs, which somehow bore no resemblance in taste to actual eggs, tinned jam, which possessed the adhesive quality to glue your jaw shut, and a scattering of oatmeal, chocolate, and dried fruits, all arriving in tins that required a crowbar and a prayer to open. The British Army made no pretense that its food was delicious. It merely asserted that it was sufficient, and in fairness, it kept soldiers alive, albeit barely. Field kitchens occasionally provided stews, stewed prunes, and the rare surprise, a genuine egg, a slice of fresh bread, or something not immediately soul-crushing. But regardless of the food, there was always tea. Shells could fall, trucks could explode, but if there was hot water, there was a brew. And in that steaming mug, nestled in a muddy trench, lay Britain's greatest ration of all, stubbornness in a cup. By the midpoint of the war, British soldiers were not merely battling the Axis powers, they were contending with ration fatigue, an insidious, invisible adversary disguised as yet another tin of corned beef. The British military supply system was tenuously held together by string, hope, and a suspicious abundance of triplicate forms. Engaging in combat across multiple continents, from North Africa to Italy and into the jungles of Burma, meant that rations grew progressively stranger the farther one ventured from London, becoming colder and often far squishier. A ration dispatched to Cairo might arrive marginally warm and palatable. Conversely, a ration intended for the Burmese jungle could reach its destination moldy, half-consumed by ants, and a full 2 weeks behind schedule. Yet, soldiers still saluted it, warmed it, and consumed it. Such was the embodiment of British resilience, quietly chewing through despair. Water was invariably boiled, not solely to eradicate bacteria, but because boiling signified tea. Tea held a sacred status. Men would willingly brave sniper fire to retrieve a kettle. A warm cup could be the pivotal difference between a complete breakdown and a fleeting moment of quintessential British dignity amidst the mud. When provisions were scarce, which was often the case, soldiers became remarkably resourceful. They rehydrated powdered milk to serve as tea whitener, spread jam onto hardtack with the blunt edge of bayonets, and seasoned their meat with copious amounts of sarcasm. One soldier reportedly concocted a stew from bully beef, raisins, and crushed vitamin tablets. The result was morally dubious but, in a technical sense, edible. Tinned food presented both a blessing and a curse. While it possessed an almost infinite shelf life, opening it demanded considerable strength, appropriate tools, and occasionally, what felt like divine intervention. Soldiers developed strong opinions regarding tin designs, dedicating entire afternoons to debating the merits of those with reliable keyrolls versus the infernal, handle-less varieties. When something fresh miraculously appeared, an egg, a loaf of bread, an actual vegetable, it sparked either celebration or deep suspicion. One soldier, upon receiving a fresh tomato, reportedly stared at it for an hour before deciding to keep it as a peculiar pet. Despite the relentless rationing, the pervasive blandness, and the jaw pain inflicted by biscuits, British troops maintained their stoicism. They grumbled with dignified restraint, exchanged jokes about their own digestive woes, and above all, kept calm and carried on, preferably with a steaming cup of tea in hand. Japanese rations. Endurance forged in austerity. If the American soldier possessed plentiful rations, the German boasted meticulous organization, and the Brit relied on tea. Then the Japanese soldier possessed rice and an astonishing capacity for enduring hardship. The Imperial Japanese Army was fundamentally built upon the principle of endurance. Soldiers were indoctrinated to believe that self-denial was a noble virtue and that hunger was an integral part of their duty, a convenient philosophy. Given that most of them were perpetually on the brink of starvation, the standard Japanese field ration was less a complete meal and more a polite suggestion of sustenance. A typical pack contained white rice, barley, dried fish, pickled plums, umebashi, soy sauce concentrate, and perhaps a few hard candies. It was compact, culturally familiar, and utterly insufficient in the field. Initially, troops deployed with multi-day rations meticulously wrapped in wax paper or meticulously stored in bento-style metal tins. It appeared neat, organized, and thoughtfully prepared. And then they entered the jungle. In unforgiving environments like New Guinea, Burma, and Guadalcanal, the oppressive humidity transformed rice into a moldy, viscous goo. Rats systematically devoured supplies, and dried fish spoiled faster than one's hopes of victory. To exacerbate matters, Japan's military logistics were, to put it mildly, a catastrophic failure. Supply lines were overstretched, bombed, blockaded, or simply ceased to exist altogether. Many units endured days, even weeks, with barely a handful of rice to share amongst them. Soldiers resorted to foraging, raiding local villages, or consuming jungle plants whose nutritional value ranged from marginally beneficial to inducing hallucinations before collapse. In more desperate circumstances, they hunted lizards, insects, or even rats. One soldier recounted making a soup from boiled grass and boot leather simply to quell the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. To their credit, or perhaps to our horror, Japanese troops rarely vocalized complaints. They genuinely believed that hardship was honorable, starvation was glorious, and marching barefoot was inspirational. As for rice infested with weevils, that was simply added protein. Occasionally, miso paste or powdered green tea was available. These items were highly prized and hoarded like wartime treasures. A mere teaspoon of tea could significantly lift spirits. A pinch of salt could bring a hardened soldier to tears. But overall, caloric intake was abysmal, suffering was pervasive, and morale often stemmed from sheer cultural discipline rather than from what passed for a meal. The Japanese soldier was not merely underfed, he was rigorously trained to accept and even embrace it. And astonishingly, many of them continued to fight, not because of what was in their bellies, but because of the unwavering resolve in their minds. The Pacific Jungle. A culinary death trap. The jungles of the Pacific, from a distance, appeared lush and verdant, like a tropical paradise, assuming one could disregard the rampant diseases, the insidious leeches, and the pervasive stench of slow death. However, for soldiers on both sides, particularly the Japanese, the jungle was far from a source of sustenance. It was a leafy green death trap characterized by oppressive humidity and a hostile temperament. Supply lines in the Pacific were notoriously unreliable. Tropical storms, naval blockades, and relentless enemy ambushes all conspired to transform every delivery of rice, beans, or salt fish into an act of divine fortune. And when the food failed to arrive, the jungle offered no solace. Many Japanese units found themselves completely cut off from resupply for weeks on end. Soldiers were forced to rely on the land, which would have been acceptable if the land possessed any understanding of their plight. Unfortunately, the jungle teemed with plants that appeared edible but were poisonous, animals that were edible but impossibly fast, and insects that were not only inedible but actively aggressive. Rations spoiled within hours. Canned goods rusted shut. Rice grew mold faster than one could even start a fire. A soldier on Guadalcanal vividly wrote, "Everything here is wet. Even my appetite is damp." When fortunate, they consumed boiled roots, wild fruits, frogs, or jungle fowl, provided they could be caught. When unlucky, their diet consisted of tree bark, shoe leather, rotting palm stems, or water flavored with sheer desperation. Stories abound of soldiers boiling the same handful of rice 3 times to extract every last shred of sustenance. Others fermented what little remained into a starchy, semi-putrid porridge known chillingly as jungle glue. And then there were the horrifying rumors, accounts of cannibalism among starving units, particularly during protracted sieges. While not widespread, it did occur, men driven to the absolute brink by the horrors of war, profound isolation, and the agonizing emptiness of their stomachs. If anything can strip away the romanticism of the Pacific theater, it is that grim little footnote. Disease followed closely behind starvation. Malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever, all exacerbated by severe malnutrition, claimed countless lives. Soldiers perished not from bullets, but from hunger and insidious infection, slowly and invisibly. The jungle was impartial. It cared not for whom you fought. It offered no food, no shelter. It simply waited for you to weaken, and then it consumed you. Culinary alchemy. Improvisation on the front lines. War may decimate cities, but it also unleashes the astonishing culinary creativity of incredibly hungry, profoundly desperate individuals armed with bayonets and perhaps a single can of Spam. Across every front, soldiers didn't merely consume their rations, they negotiated with them. They bartered, swapped, stretched, crushed, fried, and occasionally, even worshipped the more palatable components. Food was fuel, certainly, but it was also a form of entertainment and, at times, a mad science experiment. In American foxholes, GIs ingeniously transformed K-ration crackers into improvised pancakes, mixing them with powdered eggs and coffee creamer, then frying the concoction over a small fire. The final product might have tasted like despair, but it was warm despair, which offered a surprising measure of comfort. Canned cheese, melted into an oily paste over hot beans, became a makeshift trench fondue. Spam, sliced, pan-fried, and layered between biscuits, formed the world's most melancholic sandwich. Even chewing gum discovered new applications, sealing leaky canteens or serving as currency to bribe a comrade for an extra cigarette. British soldiers, armed with their indestructible hardtack and enigmatic jars of jam, fashioned jam buddy sandwiches by forcibly smashing 2 biscuits together with jam until their teeth collectively surrendered. One squad in North Africa famously combined bully beef with dried fruit and dubbed it Desert Delight. Another unit christened their nightly stew Stuff, because no one, including the cook, could any longer identify its contents. On the Eastern Front, Soviet soldiers repurposed empty shell casings as soup pots, boiled cabbage in their helmets, and roasted anything with legs, including, on one memorable occasion, a stolen German sausage that required 3 men to defend it. Even the Japanese, despite their severely limited supplies, found ways to repurpose leftovers. Rice was refried with pickled vegetables to create onigiri-style cakes, and dried seaweed was hoarded for flavoring water when absolutely nothing else remained. These were not gourmet meals. They were acts of wartime alchemy. Field improvisation transformed boredom into morale, converted not enough into this will do, and rendered a great deal of food marginally less terrifying. Because when you're trapped in a trench, a jungle, or a ruined farmhouse, your mess kit becomes your kitchen, your bayonet transforms into a spatula. And your meal is a profound miracle that you've survived long enough to consume it. The lasting flavor of war, memories and meals. Long after the guns fell silent. Long after uniforms were meticulously packed away and medals carefully boxed in drawers, one indelible element remained with the veterans of World War II, the food. Or, more precisely, the memory of the food. For countless soldiers, rations were more than mere sustenance. They formed the poignant backdrop to trauma, deep camaraderie, profound grief, pervasive boredom, and enduring hope. A single bite of bully beef could vividly conjure a foxhole in France. A faint whiff of cabbage soup could transport one back to the frozen trenches outside Stalingrad. A can of Spam was not simply meat, it was a snapshot in time. Some veterans recalled their wartime meals with a dark, mordant humor. American veterans would jest about grimly choking down a deer ration as if it owed them money. British troops swapped tales of attempting to trade their hardtack biscuits with locals, only to be met with incredulous laughter. One Soviet veteran claimed he couldn't bring himself to eat bread for years after the war, not out of hatred, but because it felt like sacred ground. Food demarcated the subtle boundaries of war. A fresh apple signified proximity to a farm and, perhaps, the promise of peace. A steaming stew from a field kitchen meant you wouldn't be dying that day. Even bad coffee implied that someone cared enough to boil water. Then there were the care packages, those precious, morale-boosting gifts from home. Chocolate bars, dried fruit, powdered milk, handwritten notes tucked beside cookies. These were not just treats, they were vital emotional lifelines. Some soldiers meticulously hoarded them. Others generously shared them. A few meticulously rationed them out one bite at a time, stretching hope across weeks of unimaginable horror. And yet, some flavors lingered far too long. Veterans jokingly remarked that they could still discern the metallic taste of the tin decades later. One GI swore he could still detect the scent of Spam every time it rained. Another insisted his nightmares occasionally featured powdered eggs. Because when you eat in war, you're not merely feeding your body, you're anchoring your very existence. You're desperately attempting to remain human in a world consumed by madness. And in that context, every meal, however bland or bizarre, becomes an indelible part of who you are. So, the next time you casually toss a snack into the microwave, take a moment to consider those soldiers, cooking with firewood, bayonets, and sheer, unwavering determination. For them, every single bite was an act of survival, and the taste, it never truly faded. The fledgling American Republic found itself grappling with its first major internal turmoil almost immediately after the ink dried on the U.S. Constitution. This crisis didn't stem from foreign adversaries or political factions, but from a far more potent catalyst, whiskey. In the early 1790s, the newly independent nation was drowning in debt from the Revolutionary War. President George Washington and his astute Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, urgently needed a fiscal strategy. Hamilton, ever the financial genius, proposed an excise tax on domestically produced distilled spirits, with whiskey being the most prevalent. To the refined urban elites and coastal merchants, this seemed a perfectly sensible measure. However, to the rough-and-tumble settlers on the western frontier, it felt like a direct affront from a powdered Whig aristocrat. Out west, particularly in regions like western Pennsylvania, whiskey was more than just a beverage, it functioned as a form of currency. Farmers converted their surplus grain into whiskey because it was significantly easier to transport, less susceptible to spoilage, and far more lucrative than raw crops. Bartering whiskey for goods and services was an ingrained part of their daily existence. Consequently, when the federal government imposed a tax on it, many frontier inhabitants viewed it not as a necessary revenue-generating initiative, but as a profound betrayal. It was a stark reminder that power was seemingly gravitating back towards the same kind of distant authority they had just fought a revolution to escape. Adding insult to injury, the tax structure itself appeared meticulously designed to disadvantage small-scale producers. Large distilleries could simply remit a flat annual fee. But the multitude of small-time distillers scattered throughout the Appalachian Hills were compelled to pay per gallon. In essence, the little guy bore a disproportionately higher tax burden. With federal tax collectors arriving on horseback to enforce this new legislation, tensions quickly escalated to a boiling point. Initially, the resistance was relatively minor. Inspectors faced threats, tax documents were deliberately incinerated, and revenue officers were politely but firmly instructed to leave. Yet, this polite defiance soon morphed into outright violence. Tar and feathering rituals, a relic of colonial protests, re-emerged. Taxmen were driven from their homes. In one particularly egregious incident, a revenue officer was stripped naked, bound to a tree, and had his hair forcibly shorn, frontier justice infused with moonshine-fueled rage. And throughout this escalating turmoil, President Washington observed silently, patiently waiting, though not for long. Because what had begun as a mere tax protest was rapidly spiraling into an armed insurrection. An event that would ultimately test the very foundation of the Constitution and Washington's unwavering resolve to uphold it. The rebellion takes shape, from grumbling to guns. By 1792, the whiskey tax had become not just unpopular, but downright incendiary. In the remote, backwoods communities of Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and Virginia, opposition was transforming from sporadic grumbling into coordinated defiance. Tax collectors grew intimately familiar with two distinct sounds: the shattering of windows and the ominous crack of gunfire overhead. The western counties of Pennsylvania became the volatile epicenter of what many now openly labeled an outright rebellion. Meetings were convened in local taverns and rustic cabins, where kegs of homemade whiskey stood conspicuously beside loaded muskets. These gatherings were far from mere drunken complaints. They were meticulously organized assemblies. Local residents formed their own militias, issued direct threats to federal officials, and even passed their own resolutions vociferously condemning the excise tax. Some steadfastly refused to conduct business with anyone who complied with the tax. It was a peculiar blend of popular protest, organized intimidation, and a generous helping of corn liquor. In 1793, the situation further intensified. Tax collectors and their sympathizers were ambushed, subjected to brutal whippings, and publicly humiliated. One unfortunate individual was captured and paraded through town with a sign emblazoned with the word "coward" conspicuously hung around his neck. It was a bizarre, drunken echo of the Boston Tea Party, though undoubtedly with far worse hygiene. The federal courts responded by issuing subpoenas, aiming to bring the instigators of the rebellion to justice. However, serving legal documents proved exceedingly difficult in an environment where the local sheriff might himself be an active participant in the mob. The entire region was effectively descending into a state of lawlessness. Local officials either deliberately turned a blind eye or quietly aligned themselves with the insurgents. President Washington, typically a paragon of calm and measured deliberation, began to clench his false teeth in frustration. The Whiskey Rebellion threatened not only public order but also the very legitimacy of federal law. If the nascent government proved incapable of enforcing its own taxes, then what purpose did the Constitution serve? What was the ultimate point of governance itself? Yet, Washington did not rush to action. He dispatched federal commissioners to engage in negotiations with the rebels. However, this proved to be as futile as attempting to serve tea in the midst of a bar brawl. The rebels had already established their own committees, held conventions, and in some instances, openly discussed outright secession. They perceived themselves not as criminals, but as true patriots bravely resisting tyranny. Meanwhile, Alexander Hamilton, ever the hawk, continuously whispered urgent advice into Washington's ear. Are you truly prepared to let these individuals trample on the Constitution? After everything we've just endured? And so, George Washington arrived at a momentous decision. One that would profoundly shock the rebels and establish a pivotal historical precedent. He would raise a federal army against his own populace. Washington's army marches, a show of force. By 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion had escalated beyond a mere backcountry tantrum. It represented a direct and overt challenge to federal authority. George Washington, who had spearheaded a revolution just a decade earlier, now found himself in the extraordinary position of leading an army against fellow Americans, the very citizens he had helped liberate. And this was no mere ragtag militia. Washington summoned a force of over 12,000 troops, a contingent nearly 3 times the size of the force he commanded at the Battle of Trenton. This formidable army comprised state militias from Maryland, New Jersey, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. Many of these troops were genuine volunteers, while others were voluntold to participate. It constituted the largest federal military deployment ever assembled in the United States up to that point. And it was not marching to war with the British or the French. It was advancing westward to quell angry farmers armed with pitchforks and moonshine stills. Hamilton, never one to miss a dramatic spectacle, rode out with the army, embodying a powdered wig version of Patton. He was absolutely ecstatic. This was his grand opportunity to unequivocally demonstrate that the federal government possessed teeth and was not afraid to bite. Washington, despite his personal reluctance, fully comprehended the immense stakes involved. The rebellion transcended mere disputes over distilled spirits. It fundamentally questioned whether the United States could effectively function as a nation governed by law. If the rebels could successfully intimidate tax collectors and openly defy Congress without repercussions, then the Constitution might as well be relegated to kindling. Thus, for the first and only time in American history, a sitting president personally led troops in the field. Visualize the scene: the most renowned man in America, astride his horse, riding westward through the Allegheny Mountains, not to ignite a revolution, but to extinguish one. His very presence conveyed a chilling message: rebellion would be met not with persuasive pamphlets, but with sharp bayonets. When the formidable army finally approached the heart of the rebel territory in western Pennsylvania, the response was, to put it mildly, anticlimactic. The rebels, who had previously boasted aggressively in taverns and set fire to a few tax collectors' homes, suddenly recalled that they had urgent chores awaiting them. Most of the ringleaders simply vanished. Others fled into the dense woods or adopted the classic, "I don't know nothing about nothing" defense. There would be no grand battle, no climactic showdown. The army had marched hundreds of miles to confront a rebellion that ultimately fizzled out like flat cider. However, Washington's message resonated loudly and clearly. The federal government was not to be trifled with. With the rebellion decisively quelled before a single retaliatory shot was fired, the soldiers turned and headed home, as did George Washington. The aftermath: justice, mercy, and political divisions. Now came the inevitable cleanup: arrests, trials, and justice administered in the federal style. A handful of rebel leaders were apprehended. Though the term "leaders" might be a generous overstatement, many of the more radical agitators had successfully slipped away into the wilderness. What remained were a few unfortunate individuals who were caught due to ill-timing or poorly chosen hiding spots. Ultimately, 20 men were transported to Philadelphia to face trial for treason. The trials, however, did not unfold as Hamilton might have envisioned. Evidence was often patchy, witnesses were understandably terrified to testify, and the jury, composed of their fellow Pennsylvanians, was hardly eager to condemn their neighbors to the gallows. In the end, only 2 men were actually convicted of treason. And even those verdicts were met with a degree of skepticism. These were not dangerous warlords, they were impoverished farmers who had made regrettable decisions. And Washington, no stranger to the complexities of rebellion himself, chose mercy over vengeance. In a move that astonished some and reassured others, he pardoned both men. His message was clear: yes, the government would enforce the law, but it would not, in the process, devolve into a tyrant. This act of clemency proved to be as profoundly significant as the initial display of force. Washington had demonstrated unyielding strength, but he also exhibited crucial restraint. The new federal government was not going to cruelly crush its citizens underfoot, as a monarchy might have done. Instead, it would govern through law, tempered by justice. Meanwhile, Hamilton grumbled, wishing for more heads to roll, metaphorically if not literally. He viewed the rebellion as irrefutable proof that the common populace could not be trusted with excessive freedom, especially when whiskey was involved. But Washington grasped the deeper political implications. True legitimacy did not emanate from cracking skulls. It arose from demonstrating that the nascent republic could effectively balance authority with compassion. The rebellion had concluded, but the precedent it established would resonate for generations. The United States had successfully navigated its first genuine test of federal authority, and it did not descend into chaos. Still, lingering questions persisted. Would future presidents adhere to the same logic? Would mercy consistently follow the exercise of power? And, perhaps most importantly, was this the definitive end of frontier rebellion? Or merely the beginning? The muskets were holstered, the rebels pardoned, and the whiskey stills quietly resumed their bubbling in the hills. Politically, however, the whiskey rebellion left a lingering hangover that would persist for years. The event had unequivocally proven that the federal government possessed the undeniable power to enforce its own laws. Yet, it also ignited the fuse on deep-seated political divisions that had already been smoldering beneath the surface of the young nation. At the heart of the conflict lay two fundamentally opposing visions for America. On one side stood Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists, champions of order, commerce, a robust central government, and powdered Whigs that could, theoretically, stop a bullet. They interpreted the rebellion as clear evidence that the unruly rural areas required firm governance. On the other side were the Jeffersonian Republicans, who harbored profound distrust of centralized power. They fervently believed in the virtuous yeoman farmer, advocated for local control, and steadfastly resisted the very kind of governmental overreach they had fought a revolution to escape. To them, the federal response to the Whiskey Rebellion was not a heroic act of law enforcement. It was an act of egregious overkill. Sending 12,000 troops after a few farmers with barrels of corn mash felt akin to deploying a cannon to swat a fly. Thomas Jefferson, then serving as Washington's vice president, made no secret of his strong opinions. Privately, he acidly referred to the federal march as a monarchical adventure. He firmly believed that Washington's dramatic show of force only alienated the common man further from the government, pushing them directly into the welcoming embrace of the Republican cause. And indeed, in the immediate aftermath of the rebellion, a curious phenomenon occurred: the Republican Party began to gain significant traction. Out on the frontier, where distrust of federal authority had fermented much like whiskey itself, support for Jefferson's ideals surged. These were no longer just drunken and angry farmers, they were now voters. And they were deeply incensed at being treated like common criminals for resisting a tax they could barely afford. The rebellion had failed on the battlefield. Yet it powerfully succeeded in invigorating anti-federalist sentiment. It significantly accelerated the emergence of America's first genuine political parties, sharpening the ideological divide between those who championed a robust, centralized state and those who advocated for individual states to retain greater autonomy. So, while no conventional war had erupted, a new kind of conflict had commenced, one fought not with muskets and torches, but with ballots, impassioned speeches, and competing ideologies. At its core, the Whiskey Rebellion transcended a mere dispute over alcohol. It was fundamentally about power and deep-seated class resentment. To the small farmers of western Pennsylvania and beyond, the whiskey tax represented more than just an irksome expense. It symbolized everything they feared about the nascent federal government, that it would be operated by elites, for elites, at the profound detriment of the working poor. Most participants in the rebellion were not career criminals, many were Revolutionary War veterans. These were men who had shed blood and fought fiercely for a republic they now felt was turning its back on them. They returned from battlefields only to discover that the very government they had helped establish was now ruthlessly squeezing them financially. All while seemingly cozying up to wealthy Eastern bankers and merchants. It was akin to battling a ferocious lion, only to return home and be kicked by the household cat. To compound their grievances, many frontier inhabitants felt deliberately excluded from meaningful political participation. Representation was heavily skewed. Their voices were effectively drowned out by wealthier, urban politicians who had no grasp of life west of the Appalachians. Add to this a tax system that disproportionately burdened small producers, and the entire situation felt less like sound economic policy and more like class warfare with a distinct whiff of whiskey. There was also the critical matter of how the law was enforced. Affluent distillers could easily afford legal counsel, manage complex paperwork, and simply pay the annual flat fee. The struggling farmer with a single still and a handful of mash barrels, however, faced a federal marshal and the potential for a prison sentence. The public perception was abysmal, and the anger was palpable. In this regard, the rebellion served as an early warning signal. Class tensions were not going to magically dissipate just because America had a constitution. If anything, the inherent struggle between powerful financial centers and rural working communities was deeply embedded in the very fabric of the nation. The Whiskey Rebellion was merely the initial manifestation of this struggle. Intriguingly, some of the more radical rebels even adopted the fiery rhetoric of the French Revolution, which was unfolding concurrently. They spoke passionately of liberty, tyranny, and the inherent rights of man. To Washington and Hamilton, such language was terrifying. The last thing they desired was a Paris-style bloodbath spilling into the Ohio Valley. But to the whiskey rebels, these words were not dangerous, they were a profound promise. One they felt had already been broken. Washington's presidential precedent. Authority and restraint. George Washington's audacious decision to personally lead troops into western Pennsylvania was as bold as it was fraught with risk. At that historical juncture, many Americans perceived the presidency as a somewhat remote, almost ceremonial position, a kind of executive moderator for a government still in its formative stages. However, with this decisive march, Washington shattered that passive image. He was no passive figurehead, he was an active enforcer of federal power. For Washington, the Whiskey Rebellion represented a crucial test, not merely of law and order, but of the very legitimacy of the federal system itself. He had played a pivotal role in drafting the Constitution. And now he was putting it to the ultimate test. If he failed, if he permitted violence and intimidation to supersede legitimate legislation, the entire grand experiment of the American Republic might unravel. 13 individual states could swiftly decide they were better off pursuing their own independent paths. In that light, the rebellion was not simply a backward tantrum, it was the canary in the Democratic coal mine. Washington's personal involvement lent immense gravitas to the situation. His reputation was almost mythical, he was revered as the father of his country, a man deeply respected by veterans, admired by ordinary citizens, and feared by enemies. When news spread that Washington himself was riding westward, many rebels simply vanished into the landscape. Some found it almost impossible to believe, Washington, the champion of liberty, was now marching against citizens over whiskey? But the gamble ultimately paid off. Washington achieved victory without needing to fire a single shot. His mere presence effectively restored order. Crucially, he also understood when to cease the exercise of force. Once the rebellion dissipated, he withdrew his troops. He did not occupy the region, did not impose harsh punishments on the general populace, and did not transform it into a public spectacle of trials. He simply, yet firmly, reminded everyone that adherence to the law was not optional. Yet, not everyone applauded his actions. Some, particularly within the Jeffersonian camp, accused Washington of utilizing military force to suppress legitimate political dissent. They characterized the march as an overreaction, an excessive display of executive muscle that could have rapidly spiraled into ugliness. Even certain Federalists harbored concerns, pondering the precedent that had just been established. Nevertheless, the rebellion's swift and bloodless collapse enabled Washington to conclude his presidency on a high note. He had effectively enforced the law without becoming a despot. He had demonstrated strength without resorting to cruelty. Quietly, however, Washington understood that this would not be the last time America's fragile unity would be tested. And he likely surmised that the next challenge might not be so bloodless. Enduring echoes, the Whiskey Rebellion's legacy. Although the Whiskey Rebellion concluded with barely a whimper, its repercussions reverberated far and wide, politically, legally, and culturally. In retrospect, this seemingly minor conflict over distilled grain stands as one of the most critical constitutional stress tests in U.S. history. Firstly, it established a crucial precedent. The federal government possessed both the right and the capability to enforce its laws, even in the face of violent opposition. Prior to this event, the Constitution had existed more as a theoretical framework than a practical reality. The preceding Articles of Confederation had starkly illustrated the weakness and ineffectiveness of a decentralized government. Now, with Washington's boots on the ground, the Constitution demonstrably flexed its newfound muscles. However, with that newfound power came a lingering apprehension. Many Americans, particularly in rural areas, began to perceive the federal government not as a representative of their will, but as a distant, Eastern elite that neither understood nor cared about frontier life. The very same individuals who had once cheered the revolution now murmured about oppression emanating from Philadelphia and New York, rather than London. Culturally, the Whiskey Rebellion transformed into a legend within the Appalachian Hills. Stories were passed down through generations of brave distillers standing up to federal agents. Some narratives were embellished, others romanticized, but all carried the same underlying message: government doesn't always act in your best interest. And if you want something done, sometimes it takes more than just a vote, it demands a still, a rifle, and a few angry neighbors. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., a new capital being meticulously planned during the rebellion's aftermath, lawmakers took careful note. Future leaders would consistently reference the Whiskey Rebellion whenever civil unrest threatened the delicate balance of the republic. Was this the ideal model? A swift show of force followed by clemency, or a perilous precedent of executive overreach? And then there was the whiskey itself. Ironically, despite the rebellion's military failure, the tax never genuinely succeeded. It proved costly to enforce, was widely evaded, and remained politically toxic. By the early 1800s, under Thomas Jefferson's presidency, it was quietly repealed. The rebels lost the tactical battle, but in a peculiar, twisted way, they had triumphed in the war of public opinion. The frontier never forgot, nor did the government. Future presidents would inevitably confront their own rebellions, both grand and minor, with the spectral presence of 1794 riding just behind them. A chilling reminder that order is inherently fragile, and that the republic is perpetually one barrel of fermented grain away from boiling over. The Whiskey Rebellion might appear today as a mere historical footnote, a curious chapter in the early American narrative, but its legacy remains surprisingly vibrant. Swirling like vapor off a still, influencing everything from presidential power to the persistent strain of rural resistance. 4-1. It unequivocally demonstrated to the American populace that the Constitution was not simply parchment and promises, it possessed tangible muscle. This marked the first instance the federal government enforced a domestic law with military troops. And the fact that it did so under the personal leadership of George Washington imbued it with profound historical gravity. Every president since has inherited that weighty precedent. Leaders like Lincoln, Eisenhower, and even more recent presidents deploying the National Guard during domestic unrest, all trace a faint historical line back to 1794 and a president on horseback. The rebellion also instilled a lasting skepticism at the heart of American politics. Frontier distrust of centralized government became a fundamental component of U.S. political identity. The rebellion's failure did not diminish this. Instead, it proved to millions that distant elites could and would wield their power when it suited them. That spirit of rural defiance can still be discerned in modern anti-tax protests, states' rights arguments, and the deep-seated American affinity for local control. In essence, the rebellion sowed seeds of resistance that never truly perished, they simply fermented. Whiskey itself, believe it or not, also reaped a peculiar legacy. Far from being demonized, it gradually evolved into a potent symbol of independence and grit. The very substance that ignited a rebellion is now toasted in bars as a proud American tradition. Indeed, the American whiskey industry, particularly bourbon and rye, wears its rebellious roots like a badge of honor. You'll find distilleries named after rebellion leaders, bottle designs intended to evoke frontier spirit, and marketing slogans that practically dare the IRS to come knocking again. Finally, the event imparted a fundamental lesson to a nascent country. How it responds to dissent reveals everything about its identity. Washington chose both force and forgiveness. That delicate balance, power tempered by principle, ultimately became a cornerstone of the American ideal. While not always perfectly adhered to, it is consistently referenced. So, the next time you raise a glass of bourbon or rye, remember that it's not merely liquor in that bottle. It's a complex narrative of power, protest, and a young republic earnestly striving to define what kind of nation it was destined to be. Cheers to the rebellion that helped shape a nation. Around 1754 BCE, King Hammurabi of Babylon meticulously etched his now famous code onto a massive basalt stele, a towering legal monolith designed to instruct his subjects and assert divine justice. It stands as one of the earliest known attempts to formally codify laws in human history. Yet, embedded within its 282 meticulously crafted articles lies something as ancient as law itself: the regulation of women. In Hammurabi's Babylon, a woman was not simply an individual, she embodied a specific role. Daughter, wife, widow, mother, each of these roles carried a precise legal definition, a set of social expectations, and, if circumstances went awry, a prescribed punishment. Consider, for instance, the institution of marriage. Women could be married off by their fathers, essentially transferred from one patriarchal household to another. Once married, a woman was unequivocally expected to maintain fidelity. If she was accused of adultery, both she and her alleged lover could be bound and thrown into a river. This was no mere metaphor. The textual prescription is chillingly literal. However, if her husband chose to spare her life, the court frequently acquiesced, a grimly romantic gesture, in a way. Conversely, if a man was unfaithful to his wife, Hammurabi's code evinced considerably less concern. Male infidelity was hardly headline news in ancient Mesopotamia. The imbalance was stark. Female honor was intrinsically linked to family honor, while male honor possessed a far greater degree of flexibility. Hammurabi's code, a double-edged sword for women. Yet, not every legal stipulation in Hammurabi's code was overtly oppressive. Some provisions surprisingly extended certain protections to women, particularly widows. A widow possessed the legal right to remain in her deceased husband's dwelling and manage his assets until her sons reached maturity. In the absence of male heirs, she could even inherit property directly. In this respect, Hammurabi's code acknowledged a woman's capacity for financial and legal agency, though strictly confined within the rigid boundaries of the family structure. Laws pertaining to divorce also existed. A woman could petition to leave her husband if he was proven cruel or neglectful, but substantiating such claims was a formidable challenge. If her allegations could not be verified, she risked being publicly branded as a liar and subjected to severe penalties. Justice, it seemed, was not entirely impartial, it simply squinted harder when the accused woman wore a veil. So, what insights does Hammurabi's code offer regarding women in ancient Babylon? it reveals they were far from invisible. On the contrary, they were explicitly named, systematically categorized, frequently judged, and at times, afforded protection, but always through the pervasive lens of control. The law prescribed their place, but rarely granted them the authority to meaningfully shape it. Ancient Egypt, progressive rights, social constraints. Journey a few hundred miles west from Babylon and fast forward several centuries, and you arrive in ancient Egypt. A civilization where the concept of justice was personified by Ma'at, the goddess of truth, balance, and cosmic order. In stark contrast to many of their Mesopotamian neighbors. The Egyptians held a remarkably progressive view, at least on paper, concerning women's legal rights. Egyptian women, irrespective of their social standing, possessed the legal right to own property, inherit land, sue and be sued, and even initiate divorce. These were not merely theoretical rights inscribed on tomb walls, they were actively practiced. Particularly in bustling urban centers like Thebes and Memphis. Women could enter into contracts, serve as legal witnesses, and draft wills. A woman could independently operate a business, lend money, or acquire slaves and livestock. In essence, Egyptian law recognized women as legal individuals, rather than mere extensions of their husbands. This degree of autonomy might appear remarkably ahead of its time, and in many respects, it was. Women were not barred from entering temples or legal courts. In fact, priestesses fulfilled significant legal and ritualistic roles, and some even ascended to positions as judges or scribes. Legal documents from the New Kingdom clearly illustrate instances of women filing complaints against male relatives and emerging victorious. However, and there's always a caveat, this relative legal freedom was accompanied by considerable social constraints. The vast majority of women still lived under the overarching authority of a father or husband. While they possessed the right to own land, they were often implicitly expected to pass it down through male heirs. The law may have granted permission, but societal norms frequently whispered a subtle, not quite. Marriage, though not formally a religious institution in Egypt, was nonetheless legally binding. Husbands and wives could pursue divorce for a variety of reasons, including infertility, infidelity, or even profound emotional incompatibility. Divorce did not carry a significant social stigma, and children were typically entrusted to the care of the mother, who retained rights to her dowry and frequently received additional property. Legal punishments were theoretically applied equally. But in practical terms, social class and familial connections often wielded far greater influence than gender. A noble woman might evade consequences for actions that would send a peasant woman directly to the crocodiles, literally. So, was ancient Egypt a feminist utopia? Not precisely. But compared to the rigid patriarchies of Mesopotamia or the later Greek world, it offered women something quite rare, the capacity to participate in legal life as bona fide persons, rather than mere possessions. In a world governed by deities and pharaohs, that was no insignificant achievement. Ancient India, Dharma, duty, and contradictions. In ancient India, the legal standing of women was profoundly shaped by Dharma, the intricate moral and social order central to Hindu philosophy. Codified in foundational texts such as the Manusmriti, Laws of Manu. This framework presented a deeply hierarchical and duty-driven system where women were simultaneously honored, protected, and respected, provided they remained within their prescribed societal roles. The Manusmriti, compiled sometime between 200 BCE and 200 CE, offered extensive commentary on women, much of it strikingly contradictory. On one page, it famously declared that, where women are honored, there the gods rejoice. Yet, on another, it ominously warned that, a woman must never be independent. The overall tone oscillated wildly between reverence and stringent restriction, between divine commendation and domestic confinement. Women were legally bound to male guardians throughout their entire lives, under their father during childhood, their husband during marriage, and their sons during widowhood. This unwavering triad of male control was not merely a cultural norm, it was explicitly encoded into law. Personal autonomy was not the ideal, obedience was paramount. Marriage laws were particularly inflexible. A woman's primary duty was to marry, bear male offspring, and faithfully serve her husband. Widow remarriage was generally frowned upon or outright prohibited, depending on the specific caste and historical period. Sati. The infamous practice wherein widows were expected to immolate themselves on their husband's funeral pyre, was not universally enforced but found moral validation in certain legal and religious texts. The Manusmriti did not explicitly command it, but crucially, it also did not condemn it. That said, exceptions did exist. Women of the upper castes occasionally received an education and could inherit property in the absence of male heirs. In some regions and during specific periods, matrilineal traditions persisted. Particularly in the southern parts of the subcontinent. Women could serve as advisors, poets, and even rulers, although such instances were rare and typically exceptional. Divorce was uncommon and generally met with disapproval, though certain grounds, such as impotence, extreme cruelty, or abandonment, were sometimes recognized. Still, it was invariably the man who possessed greater legal latitude to dissolve a marriage. Punishments, too, were distinctly gendered. A woman found guilty of adultery could face disfigurement or outright ostracism. A man, by contrast, might incur a fine or a mere slap on the wrist, particularly if he held high social status. In sum, ancient Hindu law enveloped women in layers of veneration and severe restriction. They were considered sacred, but sacred in the manner of a temple statue, not as a free citizen, revered. Yet rarely truly empowered. Ancient Greece, the paradox of liberty for men. When we reflect on ancient Greece, our minds often conjure images of democracy, profound philosophy, and compelling drama. However, for half of the population, women, the legal system was far less about lofty ideals and far more about practical invisibility. Especially in classical Athens. Women were legally perceived not as independent individuals, but as perpetual minors, permanently bound to the guardianship, kyrios, of their nearest male relative throughout their lives. Under Athenian law, women were forbidden from voting, owning property independently, or representing themselves in a court of law. They could not enter into contracts or even leave their homes without a male escort. In many respects, if Hammurabi's code defined women as legally subordinate, Athenian law perfected the art of completely excluding them from public and legal life. Marriage was more akin to a property transaction than a romantic union. A woman's kyrios. Typically her father or brother, meticulously arranged her marriage, and she then relocated into her husband's household as part of a formal exchange of dowries and land. Legally, she was essentially transferred like livestock, a living, breathing asset passed between men. And yet, paradoxically, her fidelity held immense legal significance. If an Athenian woman committed adultery, her husband possessed the legal right to divorce her immediately, and any man caught with her could face execution. Yes, execution, often without trial. The irony was glaring: her husband could engage in sexual relations with courtesans or slaves without any legal repercussions. Double standards were not just common. They were deeply embedded within the very structure of the legal system. Women could not unilaterally initiate divorce themselves. But they could return to their father's house if they were abandoned or subjected to mistreatment. However, any subsequent legal action on their behalf had to be undertaken by a male relative. Even in dire cases of rape or assault, a woman herself could not bring charges, her kyrios was compelled to speak for her. There were notable exceptions. In Sparta, women enjoyed considerably more freedom. They could own land, receive an education, and move about freely in public. However, Spartan women were a distinct anomaly, not the prevailing norm. In most Greek city-states, the name of a respectable woman was supposed to be spoken as little as possible. The ideal woman was characterized by modesty, silence, and invisibility. Yet, despite the pervasive shadows of Greek law, women persevered. They raised generations, skillfully managed households, and in some rare instances, wielded considerable influence from behind the veil of legal restrictions. But officially, they were not citizens, they were mere shadows in a system that prized logic and liberty exclusively for men. Ancient Rome, pragmatism and a glimmer of autonomy. In the world of ancient Rome, the law was an immensely powerful instrument. And like virtually everything else Roman, it was meticulously structured, rigidly hierarchical, and intensely pragmatic. Roman women were by no means equal citizens, however, compared to their Greek counterparts. They occupied a slightly more visible and legally complex space within society. At birth, a Roman woman fell under the patria potestas, or the absolute authority, of her father. Upon marriage, that authority could either formally transfer to her husband, manus marriage, or, increasingly over time, remain with her natal family, sine mana marriage. The latter became progressively more common and allowed married women to retain distinct legal ties to their original household, and in some cases, even manage property independently. This significant shift opened the door for women, particularly widows or wealthy daughters, to own estates, manage businesses, and draft contracts. While women were definitively barred from voting or holding public office, they possessed the right to sue in court, often with a male sponsor, act as guardians, and accumulate substantial wealth. Nevertheless, Roman law drew a firm line around acceptable female behavior. The ideal Roman woman was pudica, modest, loyal, and obedient. Adultery, once treated as a private familial offense, was elevated to a public crime under Emperor Augustus's sweeping moral reforms. A woman found guilty could lose her dowry, face exile, or endure even worse penalties. Meanwhile, a man's infidelity remained largely without legal consequence. Once again, patriarchy rarely missed an opportunity to reinforce its double standards. However, unique social roles occasionally offered exceptions. Vestal virgins, the sacred priestesses of Vesta, were the sole women legally emancipated from male guardianship. They pledged 30 years of chastity in exchange for immense prestige, unparalleled legal independence, and the extraordinary power to pardon condemned prisoners. Yet, a broken vow of chastity meant a gruesome end, being buried alive. Divine authority came with cruel consequences. Roman matrons, respectable married women of the upper classes, wielded significant social power. They influenced politics through their extensive family connections, meticulously arranged marriages, and even participated in public mourning rituals. The legal system acknowledged their elevated status through protections for their property and legal mechanisms like tutela, a type of male guardianship that, by the imperial period, was often largely symbolic rather than restrictive. So, while Roman women certainly lived within a legal cage, the bars were spaced just far enough apart to permit a degree of movement. Especially for those born into wealth and prestige. They were undoubtedly constrained, yes, but never entirely silenced. Ancient Hebrew society. Divine law and patriarchal order. In ancient Hebrew society, law transcended mere civic structure, it was understood as divine instruction. Primarily found in the Torah and subsequently interpreted by rabbis. These religious legal texts created a comprehensive framework that governed nearly every facet of life, including the designated roles, stipulated rights, and inherent restrictions placed upon women. And like many ancient legal systems, the law simultaneously elevated and limited them. At the heart of Hebrew law was the family unit, with women expected to serve as the moral and spiritual backbone of the household, yet always under overarching male authority. Fathers meticulously arranged marriages. Ancient Hebrew society, divine mandate and gendered roles. In ancient Hebrew society, the legal framework transcended mere civic structure. It was fundamentally regarded as divine instruction, primarily rooted in the Torah and subsequently expounded upon by rabbis. These sacred legal texts established a comprehensive system that governed every facet of life, including the prescribed roles, stipulated rights, and inherent restrictions placed upon women. And like many other ancient legal traditions, this framework both elevated and constrained them. At the core of Hebrew law lay the family unit, with women expected to fulfill the crucial role of the moral and spiritual foundation of the household, though perpetually under male authority. Fathers meticulously arranged marriages. Husbands served as the undisputed heads of households. Sons inherited land, while daughters, conversely, were anticipated to marry outside the family and bring with them a dowry, often possessing no inheritance rights themselves unless there were no male heirs. Nevertheless, women were far from entirely voiceless. The ketubah, a formalized marriage contract, provided them with a significant degree of legal security in the form of guaranteed financial support and explicitly outlined spousal responsibilities. If a man failed to provide his wife with sustenance, clothing, or intimacy, a woman could seek a divorce, a remarkably progressive provision for the ancient world. However, she could not unilaterally initiate it, a rabbinic court or her male kin had to advocate on her behalf. Adultery laws exhibited a stark and pronounced inequality. A married woman caught in a liaison with another man could face death by stoning, according to Deuteronomic law. A man caught with a married woman faced the same severe punishment. However, if the woman was unmarried or enslaved, the rules became considerably murkier, usually resulting in fines or forced marriage, depending on the social status of those involved. In cases of rape, the law mandated a fine and marriage to the victim, an outcome that modern sensibilities understandably find deeply problematic. Ritual purity laws also played a profound role in the legal perception of women. During menstruation or childbirth, women were deemed ritually impure and were temporarily restricted from active religious life and physical contact. These laws reinforced notions of female otherness, not necessarily as inherently sinful, but as symbolically set apart. And yet, the Hebrew Bible is replete with examples of powerful, legally influential women: Deborah the judge, Ruth the Moabite widow who skillfully navigated the complex inheritance system, and Esther, who boldly manipulated royal law to safeguard her people. These women were exceptional. But their very existence reveals that the law was not always impervious, and that extraordinary boldness, profound wisdom, and unwavering faith could sometimes carve out space where the legal framework had seemingly closed a door. The Achaemenid Empire, pragmatism and elite female autonomy. The Achaemenid Empire, established by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, presided over an immense and remarkably diverse populace, encompassing everyone from Babylonians and Egyptians to Greeks and Medes. Within this sprawling dominion, Persian law operated with a level of tolerance and pragmatism that was uncommon in many contemporary ancient societies. This legal flexibility manifested in intriguing ways regarding the status of women. While Persian law wasn't codified in a single monumental inscription like Hammurabi's code, extensive administrative records, detailed court documents, and numerous inscriptions reveal that women, particularly elite women, possessed a considerable legal presence. Notably, Persian royal and noble women were among the most autonomous in the entire ancient world. Within the royal court, powerful women like Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great and mother of Xerxes, wielded immense influence. She controlled vast estates, issued direct commands to administrators, and appeared in imperial inscriptions, not as mere decorative figures, but as legitimate landowners and power players. Records from the Persepolis fortification tablets demonstrate women receiving substantial rations, effectively managing large work crews, and overseeing agricultural production on royal estates. These were not isolated incidents. High-ranking women, especially those intimately connected to the king, held significant legal authority over labor and property. Marriage and family law in Persia skillfully blended local customs with the overarching imperial oversight. In Persian society, women possessed the right to own property, enter into contracts, and inherit land, rights that were sometimes even more secure than those granted in contemporary Greece or Rome. Dowries were legally protected, and women could reclaim them if a marriage dissolved. Divorce was permissible for both men and women, though the process often leaned in favor of the husband unless severe abuse or infertility could be definitively proven. Punishment laws, however, remained gendered. Adultery was a capital offense, particularly for women. But unlike in some neighboring cultures, the specific method and severity of punishment varied significantly by social class. A noblewoman might face exile or house arrest, while a servant could be executed. The law, as always, bowed to the dictates of hierarchy. Zoroastrianism, the empire's dominant religion, also influenced Persian perspectives on women. While spiritually both men and women held roles in the cosmic dualism of good and evil, practical religious purity laws imposed restrictions related to menstruation, childbirth, and bodily contact, mirroring patterns observed in Hebrew and Hindu systems. In summary, Persian law offered women a curious amalgam: freedom through social rank, respect through religious tenets, and limitations imposed by custom. The higher your social standing, the more pronounced your legal voice. Ancient China: hierarchy, duty, and Confucian obedience. In ancient China, law was not merely a system of regulations, it was a profound expression of harmony, hierarchy, and Confucian morality. For women, this translated into living within a legal and cultural framework that primarily viewed them through the lens of family roles and social duty rather than individual rights. The earliest codified Chinese laws emerged during the Zhou dynasty, but it was under the subsequent Han dynasty, 206 BC-E 220 CE, that legal structures began to solidify alongside pervasive Confucian ideology. Confucian teachings placed immense emphasis on the three obediences: a woman must obey her father before marriage, her husband during marriage, and her sons in widowhood. This was not simply moral advice, it directly influenced actual legal expectations and societal norms. Women were legally subordinate to men in nearly all contexts. They were forbidden from holding public office, rarely appeared in court independently, and were frequently excluded from inheritance, particularly in patrilineal families. A daughter might be cherished within the household, but the law perceived her as a temporary presence. She would eventually marry out, taking her dowry with her. Marriage was both a strategic family alliance and a binding legal contract. A man could divorce his wife for reasons as broad as jealousy or illness, though he was prohibited from doing so if she had no family to return to, had mourned his parents appropriately, or had borne him sons. Women, by stark contrast, possessed no legal power to initiate divorce unless extreme abuse could be definitively proven, and even then, her case would likely depend heavily on her male relatives intervening on her behalf. Adultery laws strikingly reflected profound gender bias. A woman caught cheating could face execution. A man engaging in an affair with a married woman might face punishment. But infidelity with a servant or concubine was often entirely overlooked. Honor and legitimacy were intimately tied to the woman's reproductive capacity. Still, exceptions existed. Some dynasties witnessed the rise of powerful imperial women like Empress Lu Ji and Empress Wu, who wielded immense political power, occasionally bending legal codes to suit their ambitions. And in peasant villages, widows who effectively managed households or assumed control of family businesses could wield significant informal authority, even if the law did not formally recognize their status. In essence, ancient Chinese law viewed women less as autonomous beings and more as stabilizers of familial order, vital to society's function, yet always secondary to the men who supposedly maintained its harmony. A global perspective: women in ancient legal systems. As we step back and survey the ancient world, From the towering ziggurats of Babylon to the majestic palaces of Rome, from Vedic India to Confucian China, one truth becomes abundantly clear: women were always written into the law. But rarely on their own terms. Nearly every ancient legal system assigned women a specific role within a fundamentally male-dominated structure. Whether in Hammurabi's Code or the Manusmriti, the fundamental legal assumption was that a woman's identity was inherently relational: daughter, wife, mother, widow. Her rights and responsibilities flowed through the men surrounding her. The law defined her existence, but it rarely truly empowered her. Some civilizations, such as Egypt and Persia, offered women a greater degree of autonomy, permitting them to own property, enter into contracts, and even inherit wealth. In these societies, noble or high-born women could carve out significant pockets of legal authority, sometimes even rivaling their male counterparts. However, such privileges were far from universal. They depended more on class, family, and specific circumstances than on any underlying belief in gender equality. Other societies, like Greece and Rome, developed highly sophisticated legal systems while simultaneously marginalizing women from public life. Greek women were largely legally invisible. Roman women possessed more agency but still lived within a scaffolding of male guardianship and pervasive social expectations. In China, Confucian values solidified the ideal of obedient femininity into legal expectation. The law was not just about punishment, it was about preserving cosmic harmony, and that meant everyone, especially women, was expected to know their place within the social order. Similarly, in Hindu law, a deep reverence for women coexisted uncomfortably with strict control and rigid moral prescriptions. Religious laws, such as Jewish halakha or Zoroastrian purity codes, often placed women at the complex intersection of the sacred and the profane. A woman's body could impart honor or impurity, blessing or danger, depending on how closely she adhered to the prescribed rules. And yet, within these intricate systems, women continuously adapted, resisted, and endured. They discovered various avenues to exert influence, through family bonds, unwavering faith, strategic property management, or sheer personal determination. Their stories may not always be prominently carved into stone steles or widely echoed in ancient law courts, but their impact moved beneath the surface, shaping households, influencing dynasties, and contributing to the very fabric of entire civilizations. Ultimately, ancient legal codes illuminate not only how societies treated women, but also how they fundamentally defined power itself and who they believed legitimately deserved to wield it. The dawn of banking, temples in Mesopotamia. Long before the advent of Wall Street. Before secure vaults, paper banknotes, and intricate savings accounts, the practice of banking originated in the mud-brick cities of ancient Mesopotamia, the veritable cradle of civilization. And, perhaps surprisingly, the first bankers were not astute financiers in suits, they were priests. In bustling city-states like Uruk, Lagash, and later Babylon, temples were more than just spiritual sanctuaries. They served as the undeniable administrative and economic hearts of urban life. These towering ziggurats and their sprawling complexes functioned as both sacred religious sites and crucial financial hubs. Farmers and merchants didn't merely visit to offer prayers. They came to deposit grain, secure loans, and settle their debts. Why temples? Because they were perceived as the most stable and trustworthy institutions available. The gods, after all, weren't prone to absconding with your deposits, and the priesthood commanded a vast retinue of scribes who meticulously maintained detailed records. When a farmer delivered a portion of his harvest to the temple granary, he would receive a clay tablet inscribed with cuneiform script. This tablet meticulously recorded the quantity of grain stored, the date of deposit, the depositor's name, and occasionally, the name of a witness. This was far more than a mere receipt. It constituted an early form of a check. These receipts could then be legitimately transferred. A farmer burdened by debt could hand over his clay tablet to a creditor as a form of repayment. A merchant could utilize them to purchase goods or settle outstanding accounts. In this ingenious way, the clay tablet became the direct ancestor of promissory notes, deposit slips, and various forms of IOUs. Temples also actively issued loans, not solely in grain, but also in silver, livestock such as sheep, and other valuable commodities. Interest rates were, by modern standards, notably high, typically hovering around 20% for grain loans and a staggering 33% for silver. These were not casual transactions either. Defaulting on a temple loan could lead to severe consequences, including the forfeiture of land, property, or even the loss of personal freedom, often resulting in debt bondage. Intriguingly, the sophisticated concept of compound interest was not only understood but also quite feared. Some ancient legal codes, such as those of Hammurabi, actively attempted to limit or regulate interest-charging practices. Others formalized debt slavery as a legitimate punishment for defaulting on loans. This was banking in its rawest, most fundamental form, both ingeniously brilliant and undeniably brutal. So, while contemporary banks may manifest as shimmering glass towers filled with sophisticated spreadsheets, their underlying architecture is ancient. The earliest financial systems weren't conceived in bustling markets, they were birthed within the sacred confines of temples. And in Mesopotamia, the gods didn't merely judge your soul, they also meticulously balanced your financial ledgers. By the time Babylon ascended to prominence under rulers like Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE, Mesopotamian banking had evolved, becoming significantly more refined and personalized. While temples and royal palaces maintained their status as crucial economic players, a novel class of financial professionals began to emerge, private money lenders. These nascent financiers didn't operate from opulent marble lobbies. They conducted their business in humble residences, bustling market stalls, or even beside temple courtyards. Yet, they possessed a crucial advantage that temples did not: flexibility. Whereas temple loans were often seasonal and intrinsically linked to agricultural cycles, private money lenders could customize arrangements for merchants, traders, and artisans. Offering loans primarily in silver, Babylon's preferred unit of exchange. Silver wasn't yet minted into coins, that groundbreaking innovation would appear much later. Instead, it was meticulously weighed out by the shekel, and loan agreements were meticulously documented on clay tablets. These tablets comprehensively detailed the borrower, the lender, the precise amount lent, the stipulated interest rate, the repayment due date, and sometimes even the collateral provided. If a debtor failed to fulfill their obligations, lenders possessed the legal right to seize land, goods, or even family members. Some contracts read more like stern threats than amicable agreements. One particularly fascinating development was the emergence of joint liability loans, where two or more individuals collectively shared responsibility for repayment. This mechanism effectively reduced the lender's risk and subtly laid the groundwork for what we now refer to as co-signed loans. Debt was a pervasive element in Babylonian society. Farmers borrowed to finance crop planting, merchants sought loans to fund extensive caravan expeditions, and builders secured credit for large-scale construction projects. While debt slavery was a very real and ever-present danger, the legal system eventually began to offer some limited resistance. Hammurabi's renowned code provided certain forms of relief. For example, if a severe storm decimated your crops, you might be temporarily exempted from interest payments for that season. Babylon also pioneered the use of promissory notes and letters of credit, instruments utilized to transfer funds across distances without the necessity of transporting physical silver. These innovative tools empowered wealthy merchants to expand trade and move capital without the inherent risk of robbery, serving as a rudimentary precursor to the modern banking network. It's easy to conceive of banking as a strictly modern system intricately tied to stock tickers and fluctuating interest rates. However, in ancient Babylon, the same fundamental mechanisms, lending, collateral, interest, and risk assessment, were already profoundly shaping lives and livelihoods. Their instruments might have been crafted from clay rather than computer code. But the underlying game remained remarkably consistent. Ancient Egypt, granaries, scribes, and state control. In ancient Egypt, economic life revolved around two unwavering constants: the predictable flow of the Nile River and the immense capacity of the pharaoh's granaries. While Egypt didn't cultivate a formal banking system mirroring that of Mesopotamia or later Greece, it nonetheless maintained highly sophisticated financial practices deeply rooted in temples, royal treasuries, and vast, state-administered storage networks. Instead of circulating coins or silver shekels, Egypt's economy was fundamentally built upon grain. Wheat and barley were not just essential foodstuffs, they functioned as the primary currency. Taxes, wages, and debts were frequently measured in sacks of grain, and these substantial quantities were meticulously stored in colossal, centralized granaries. Much like their Babylonian counterparts, Egyptian temples served as both sacred religious sites and pivotal economic centers, providing secure storage facilities and meticulous financial record-keeping offices. Scribes diligently recorded every delivery, withdrawal, and transaction on ostraca, pottery shards, or on precious papyrus scrolls. These served as receipts, binding contracts, and even rudimentary forms of checks. If you deposited, say, 10 sacks of grain at the temple granary in Thebes, you might receive a receipt that could then be traded or presented elsewhere to retrieve an equivalent amount, a clear precursor to modern bank drafts. Loans were a commonplace feature of this system. A farmer might borrow seed grain for spring planting, promising repayment after the harvest, typically with interest. Rates varied, but an interest rate of 25 to 30% on grain loans was not uncommon. These loans were rigorously enforced by scribes and local officials, and default could tragically result in the forfeiture of land, livestock, or even personal labor. Unlike Babylon, however, private lending in Egypt was more constrained. The state played an overwhelmingly dominant role in organizing and controlling economic exchange. High officials, powerful priests, and royal administrators were the principal actors in large-scale financial activities. Nevertheless, surviving records do reveal instances of private individuals, including women, acting as lenders and creditors within local communities. These cases were less frequent, but they powerfully demonstrate a degree of grassroots financial agency that is not always fully acknowledged. The introduction of coinage occurred only during the late period, largely influenced by foreign powers such as the Persians and later the Greeks. Yet, even then, Egyptians largely preferred their established grain and barter systems over metal currency, providing compelling evidence that a functional economy doesn't inherently require coins, only trust, reliable storage, and meticulous records. Thus, while ancient Egypt may have lacked the sleek columns of a Roman bank or the aggressive contracts of Babylon, it operated a highly organized, temple-based economy built upon grain, writing, and bureaucracy, laying the enduring groundwork for a financial infrastructure that persisted for thousands of years. Ancient Greece, coins, money changers, and maritime ventures. With the ascendance of influential city-states like Athens and Corinth in the 5th century BCE, ancient Greece ushered in two transformative financial revolutions, the minted coin and the specialized money changer. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, where bulk grain and weighed silver were the dominant currencies, the Greeks wholeheartedly embraced metal coinage as a public standard, stamped, meticulously regulated, and formally guaranteed by the state. This pivotal shift created a new class of financial professionals known as the trapetitai, plural of trapezites, named after the trapeza, or table, from which they conducted their business in the bustling agora, marketplace. These individuals functioned as multifaceted financial intermediaries, money changers, deposit takers, lenders, and sometimes outright financiers. They adeptly exchanged foreign coins, securely held money for safekeeping, offered various types of loans, and even maintained detailed accounts for their clientele. Representing a rudimentary form of checking. Need to transfer funds to another city-state? No problem. The trapezites could issue a written draft, enabling merchants to avoid the perilous necessity of traveling with heavy, theft-prone coinage. If this sounds remarkably similar to a modern bank transfer, that's because it was. Albeit with more sand and significantly fewer algorithms. Lending constituted a colossal portion of Greek banking activities. Interest rates were generally high, particularly for inherently risky ventures like maritime trade. Some loans carried staggering interest rates of 100% or even more, a rate justified by the extreme dangers of shipwreck, piracy, or violent storms. These perilous loans were meticulously backed by maritime contracts, which meticulously detailed the cargo, the planned route, the repayment terms, and any provided collateral. If the ship sank, the loan was mercifully voided. If it returned safely, both the merchant and the lender could anticipate substantial profits. Private citizens also regularly acted as lenders. Wealthy Athenians often invested in smaller loans secured by tangible property or even slaves. These transactions were meticulously documented before witnesses and scribes and could be legally enforced in court. Indeed, Greek courts were frequently overwhelmed with debt cases, serving as an early testament to the eternal interrelationship between money, trust, and legal disputes. And yet, banks in ancient Greece were not formalized institutions in the way we perceive them today. They were more akin to financial freelancers with established, individual reputations. There were no official licenses, no governmental regulation, and certainly no state insurance. If your trapezite suddenly absconded with your deposit, you were simply out of luck. Trust was the paramount currency, and it could be irrevocably shattered in an instant. Despite these inherent risks, the Greek financial world thrived. It robustly facilitated trade, vigorously supported empire-building endeavors, and even bankrolled wars. In a city where logic and spirited debate reigned supreme, so too did contracts, ledgers, and the relentless logic of interest rates. Ancient Greece powerfully demonstrated that once a coin is stamped and assigned value, the rest inevitably follows, from debt and profit to risk and ruin. Ancient Rome, imperial finance and legal sophistication. By the time Rome asserted its dominance over the Mediterranean, banking had evolved from small-scale lending into a full-blown financial engine that powered an entire empire. The Romans, with their characteristic pragmatism, didn't invent banking. But they undeniably perfected it, expanded it, and deeply embedded it into the very fabric of everyday life. At the core of Roman finance were the argentarii, the Roman equivalent of bankers. These individuals operated out of tabernae, shops, conveniently located near the forum and functioned as comprehensive financial agents, money changers, deposit takers, lenders, and facilitators of payments. They skillfully exchanged coins from across the vast empire, securely held private deposits for safekeeping, dispensed loans, and even executed payments between third parties. Affluent Romans, including influential senators, deposited substantial sums with these bankers, who meticulously maintained ledgers called rations, the direct ancestors of our modern account books. A client could readily authorize an argentarius to disburse funds to another person directly from their deposit, effectively creating an early version of the check. Need to transmit money to Carthage or Alexandria? No need to pack a cumbersome bag of coins, your argentarius could efficiently issue a letter of credit. The true impetus behind Roman banking, however, was credit. Loans were not merely reserved for emergencies, they were routinely utilized for trade, extensive land purchases, ambitious construction projects, and even political election campaigns. Lending at interest, typically around 12%, though it could fluctuate based on risk, was entirely legal, though subject to some regulation. The charging of excessively high interest was generally frowned upon, but often overlooked in practice. Collateral was a critical component of these transactions. Land, slaves, or future earnings could all serve to secure a loan. And Rome possessed robust legal enforcement mechanisms. If you failed to repay your debts, you could be dragged to court, have your property seized, or in extreme, albeit rare, cases, be forced into bonded labor. Unlike earlier societies, Rome permitted the formation of corporations of financiers, known as societates publicanorum, or publicani, to handle large-scale government contracts, including critical tax collection. These were profit-seeking enterprises complete with investors, managers, and shareholders, making them eerily similar to modern banks and hedge funds. Yet, inherent risks persisted. Roman bankers were not state-backed, and financial crises did indeed occur. Historical records indicate that some banking houses experienced spectacular collapses, triggering widespread waves of panic. Sound familiar? In the Roman world, money flowed freely through temples, forums, and private estates, binding together farmers, traders, soldiers, and senators. And as the empire grew wealthy through conquest, its intricate financial system stretched like invisible roads, connecting diverse peoples not with stone, but with credit, debt, and interest. State control and the coin revolution. Before the very concept of a central bank existed, the idea of state control over currency was already fundamentally revolutionizing how economies operated. In ancient times, the power to mint coins was not just an economic prerogative. It was a profound political statement. Whoever issued the currency commanded the trust of the populace, and that trust became the very bedrock of early banking systems. The earliest known coins first appeared in Lydia, modern-day Turkey, around 600 BCE, crafted from electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver. These stamped pieces marked a revolutionary shift from merely weighed metal to a standardized currency. No longer was there a need to meticulously measure silver chunks in a dusty marketplace. Now, value could be verified at a single glance. Other civilizations swiftly adopted this groundbreaking idea. The Greeks minted their drachmas, the Persians issued darics, and the Romans constructed an entire empire on their denarii. These coins invariably bore state symbols, images of gods or rulers, and explicit inscriptions, not merely to represent value, but to powerfully signal legitimacy and control. A coin was as much a piece of propaganda as it was a practical financial tool. With the advent of state-backed coinage came new financial behaviors. Hoards of coins were securely stored in temples, private households, and merchant treasuries. Lending became significantly easier and more portable. Coins could circulate rapidly across city-states. And with uniform weights and consistent metal content, traders could move goods across borders with enhanced confidence. In turn, early bankers, from the Mesopotamian lenders to the Roman argentarii, readily adapted to this new financial certainty. They no longer needed to painstakingly test weights or purity with such frequency. Instead, they primarily tracked coins by type, year of issue, and the issuing authority. This newfound consistency drastically reduced transaction friction, facilitated the expansion of trade routes, and rendered loans far more predictable. Coinage also played an undeniable role in economic phenomena like inflation and monetary policy, albeit in rudimentary forms. Rulers could debase coins by incorporating cheaper metals into the alloy, thereby stretching the treasury's resources but, in doing so, undermining public trust. Roman emperors famously resorted to this practice to pay their vast armies, invariably triggering cycles of devaluation and economic instability. Still, the core idea endured. Currency backed by a state, stamped with its unique symbol, and guaranteed in value. This fundamental concept laid the groundwork for everything from medieval gold coins to modern fiat money. In a profound way, each ancient coin was more than just a piece of metal. It was a promise, a contract, and a potent tool of empire. It communicated not only how much something was worth, but also who possessed the power to make that determination. Temples, the sacred vaults of ancient finance. In the ancient world, the demarcation between faith and finance was often remarkably thin, if it existed at all. Temples didn't just serve the gods, they simultaneously functioned as the earliest safe deposit boxes, banks, and loan offices. Why? Because people fundamentally trusted the gods far more than they trusted fallible kings, shrewd merchants, or itinerant money lenders. Consider Delphi, for instance. The sanctuary of Apollo was not merely a significant religious destination, it was a veritable financial powerhouse. City-states deposited their war funds there. Wealthy individuals entrusted their fortunes to its care, and treasuries were purposefully constructed within the temple precincts. Religious centers like Delos, Ephesus, and Jerusalem also effectively acted as de facto banks, offering unparalleled security, immense prestige, and the services of scribes who meticulously maintained careful records. A vault safeguarded under divine watch was perceived as infinitely more secure than any private home or fortified stronghold. These venerable temples fulfilled several crucial financial roles. They securely held deposits, issued various types of loans, and in some documented cases, even collected interest. In Mesopotamia, as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, temple priests rigorously oversaw lending systems where borrowers repaid their debts with grain or silver. In Egypt, temple granaries served as vast repositories of wealth, issued receipts, and effectively facilitated widespread trade. In Greece and Rome, temples frequently held public funds, safeguarded the spoils of war, and underwrote the financing of major construction projects and grand festivals, all under the sacred seal of a revered deity. And temples were far from being passive vaults. They actively lent money. In Athens, for example, the Temple of Athena on the Acropolis extended loans of silver to the state at interest to fund significant public works. The gods, it seemed, were remarkably patient creditors. Religion also furnished the essential ethical framework for finance. Ancient Hebrew law, for instance, explicitly prohibited charging interest to fellow Israelites, but permitted it for foreigners, a moral boundary that artfully blended spiritual identity with economic policy. Hindu Dharma texts meticulously laid out rules for fair lending, debt repayment, and even the spiritual consequences of financial misconduct. Of course, these systems were not without their vulnerabilities. Temples could be looted during times of war, and clerics, being human, could be corrupt. But for the majority of the ancient world, temples remained the most universally trusted institutions, enduring, stable, and powerfully reinforced by divine fear. So, when you envision ancient banking, don't merely imagine dusty coins and cloaked lenders. Picture instead gleaming golden statues, fragrant incense, and majestic marble columns. Because for thousands of years, the safest place to entrust your money was not beneath a mattress, but beneath the watchful, omniscient eyes of the gods. Lending and debt. The ancient foundations of credit. Long before the invention of credit cards or sophisticated mortgage calculators, ancient economies operated on a system that was surprisingly familiar: borrow now, pay later, with interest. Whether you were a Mesopotamian farmer, a Greek merchant, or a Roman senator, if you required capital, you inevitably approached a lender. However, the ancient rules governing lending were often considerably harsher, and the consequences of default far more immediate and personal. Interest was not just permitted, it was expected. In Babylon, rates were remarkably steep, 20% for grain and 33% for silver, frequently compounded annually. These figures were not considered predatory, they were the accepted standard. High risk invariably meant high reward, and borrowers explicitly understood that if the harvest failed or a caravan did not return, they remained entirely liable for the debt. Temples and private lenders alike amassed considerable fortunes from these loans, and unpaid debt could tragically lead to debt slavery or the immediate seizure of property. In ancient Greece, particularly in Athens, interest rates fluctuated significantly depending on the perceived risk involved. The riskiest loans were maritime loans. A lender might advance silver to finance a trading voyage, fully aware that the ship could sink or be seized by pirates. To offset such substantial risk, rates could soar to 100% or even higher. But if the ship returned safely, both the merchant and the lender could reap immense profits. The Romans added formidable legal muscle to these arrangements. Loan contracts were meticulously written, formally witnessed, and officially sealed. Collateral, land, goods, or even slaves, was meticulously recorded in explicit detail. Miss a single payment? Your creditor possessed the legal right to drag you to court, seize your property, or in rare cases, compel you into bonded labor. Roman law set a nominal interest cap of 12%. But numerous loopholes and exemptions rendered that figure flexible, especially during periods of economic distress. Despite the inherent risks, borrowing was a pervasive practice. Farmers borrowed seed. Merchants borrowed to acquire goods for trade. Politicians borrowed to finance their ambitious campaigns. Lending undeniably greased the gears of ancient economies. And default was an acknowledged, albeit painful, hazard. And yes, fraud and manipulation were an undeniable part of the game. Lenders sometimes demanded illicit bribes or tacked on dubious administrative fees. Borrowers, conversely, might lie about collateral or simply disappear entirely. Without the benefit of modern credit scores or comprehensive banking regulations, trust and reputation were absolutely paramount. In the final analysis, ancient loans were not just financial tools. They were potent power plays. To borrow was to risk more than mere money, it was to stake your land, your personal freedom, and sometimes even your family. On the precarious chance that tomorrow would bring betterment, or at the very least, profitability. The enduring legacy of ancient banking. From the humble grain receipts of Mesopotamia to the meticulous silver ledgers of Rome, ancient banking was not simply a footnote in economic history. It was the fundamental foundation. These early systems of deposits, loans, interest, and financial record-keeping didn't merely fuel local trade. They quietly shaped the very architecture of global finance that we recognize today. At the core of every ancient banking system lay the same fundamental challenge we grapple with today: trust. Could people trust that the weighed silver was fair? That the grain stored in the temple granary wouldn't spoil or mysteriously vanish? That the lender wouldn't suddenly disappear with their hard-earned deposit? And out of that pervasive need for trust, or the desperate lack thereof, arose meticulous record-keeping, binding contracts, and ultimately, sophisticated institutional finance. The innovations achieved were astonishing for their time. Ancient Babylonians meticulously developed loan contracts with fixed interest rates, clear repayment terms, and legal witnesses, all precisely inscribed in cuneiform. Ancient Greeks pioneered the concept of letters of credit, allowing funds to be transferred between distant city-states without the perilous need to physically carry coins. The Romans established formal bankers' associations and rigorously formalized debt enforcement within civil law, constructing a financial system that could span from the reaches of Britain to the distant lands of Syria. Even today, the echoes of ancient banking resonate powerfully. The modern check, for instance, directly evolved from Mesopotamian clay receipts. The fundamental concept of collateralized loans is deeply rooted in Babylonian and Roman practices. And the very notions of central banking and monetary policy trace their ancestry back to ancient rulers who shrewdly manipulated coin purity or utilized temple wealth to fund their armies and ambitious public projects. And what of regulation? Well, it turns out ancient societies understood the perils of financial crisis all too well. In Babylon, kings periodically declared debt forgiveness to prevent widespread social collapse. Roman emperors sometimes imposed interest caps to curb predatory lending. These were not merely economic decisions. They were astute political acts aimed at maintaining societal balance and stability. But perhaps the greatest legacy of ancient banking is the profound realization that finance is not new. The tools have undeniably changed, clay tablets have become complex spreadsheets, silver shekels have transformed into intangible digital currencies. Yet, the fundamental human behaviors remain constant: risk, ambition, trust, fear, and the enduring hope of gain. The next time you log into your banking app or swipe a credit card, remember you're not doing anything novel. You are participating in a system that began with scribes in ancient temples, coins stamped by powerful kings, and farmers betting their entire harvest on the promise of a better season. And it all began with a deceptively simple idea: sometimes, to build the future, you have to borrow from it.